As the ship cut through the waves, one of the witches on board grabbed everyone's attention. She yelled out that she had spotted the port. In no time, the deck was buzzing with excitement. It had been a month and a half, and finally, they were almost there. Captain Jack couldn't help but smile at the sight of the joyous witches, but he noticed Camilla wasn't sharing in the celebration. She stood apart, looking more like she'd just swallowed something sour. Curious, Jack asked, what's got her looking so glum? He thought today's supposed to be a good day. Camilla's thoughts were elsewhere, fixated on no one but the king of Grey Castle. Even though several witches had already made the trip to Neverwinter, and Tilly had sung the city's praises, the notion of nobles still left a bad taste in her mouth. She was about to mutter something about the nobles being all bad people, but Jack's words cut her off, saying if he wasn't mistaken, with a smile pointed out that she was also a noble, and from Grey Castle as well. Camilla opened her mouth to argue, but all that came out was a sigh. Jack took a long drag from his pipe and gazed out at the endless ocean. He mused that judging someone solely by their title isn't much different from hating someone just because they're a witch. Camilla fell silent again. Jack quickly apologized, saying how he didn't mean to get all philosophical on her. He just didn't want the past to cloud her vision. Just then, the lookout in the crow's nest shouted that they were nearing the shore. Soon enough, Camilla could see the port, adorned with all sorts of red banners welcoming them to Neverwinter. The docks were packed with people, even kids waving excitedly at the approaching ship. Jack couldn't help but be impressed. Well, would you look at that? Quite the welcome party. If nothing else, this king deserves some trust for rolling out the red carpet, don't you think? What the witches didn't know was that the welcoming committee had been paid to be there. Wendy, standing beside Scroll, worried that if slumbering Isle witches found out, they might not feel so great about the warm reception. But Scroll, ever the realist, pointed out that finding volunteers to welcome a bunch of witches from slumbering Isle would have been a tall order. Sure, the locals might accept witches, and some might even admire the witch union, but everyone else was still strangers from a distant land. Wendy nodded, seeing the sense in Scroll's words. Scroll then shrugged, saying sometimes, money really does make the world go round. As the witches from the slumbering Isle began to disembark, it was time for Wendy to make her entrance. With her signature big sister smile, Wendy warmly welcomed them to Neverwinter. Leading the way, she guided them to a specially constructed apartment building. As they arrived, a chorus of awe echoed through the group at the sight of the tall, beautiful structure. Wendy explained that this place had been built just for them, and the success of the construction was largely thanks to Lien. The witches turned to Lien in surprise. They had always thought her power was just about moving land up and down, but this was next level. Lien blushed, scratching her head, saying she only helped the workers build up some slopes, and when they needed to add a new floor, she just raised the nearby ground to form a platform attached to the building, so they could work more easily. One of the girls then voiced a concern that was on everyone's mind. She then asked Lien if she had faced any hatred or disgust just for being a witch. Lien quickly shook her head, saying not at all. She reassured them, telling them the workers even shared their flatbreads with her for breakfast. Wendy knew that many of them still had doubts and concerns, which was totally understandable, given that Neverwinter was a new and unfamiliar place, and, of course, the witches had been through some rough times over the past century. But Wendy promised them all that they would find a home here. She also made it clear that even if they didn't join the witch union, they could still come to her for help with anything, no matter what it was. From the sidelines, Scroll gave her a thumbs up. Soon, Wendy led the group inside the apartment and handed out sheets of paper for everyone to fill out with their name, birthday, and abilities. As she distributed the forms, a red-haired witch spoke up, asking why did they need to fill this out while sounding skeptical. Since she only planning to stay here for 2 days, so this seems unnecessary. Another witch chimed in, agreeing. Princess Tilly already told them that they wouldn't be forced to stay here, and she was planning to visit the eastern region to see her family. A few of the more uncertain witches nodded in agreement. Ashes, however, shot a glare at the red-haired witch. It was Azima and her group stirring things up again. Wendy blinked in surprise and asked curiously, "Who's that?" Ashes, with a slight frown, explained they're a witch group from the eastern region. Just then, Tilly walked over, offering a quiet apology. She explained that this group had never fully agreed with her leadership, but compared to the Bloodfang Association, they weren't bad at heart. Tilly then turned to the red-haired witch, although she understands how they feel, wanting to go back and see for themselves. But now isn't the right time. Even though the church is gone, there's still a lot of hostility toward witches among the common folk. Before she could finish, the red-haired witch interrupted, sounding a bit defiant, thinking that's exactly why they should see it for themselves. They don't trust Tilly and even believe that she is on her brother's side. Ash's voice grew cold as she stepped forward, looming behind the red-haired witch, telling Azima to watch her tone. Azima jumped, startled, but quickly shot back, asking if she was going to fight, or maybe kill her here, like what she did with Heidi and the Bloodfang witches. Tilly hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but before she could intervene, a sudden cough broke the tension. Scroll walked over, letting out a weary sigh. She wanted everyone to take a step back. Looking at them calmly, she also had a few questions. Azima shot Scroll a glance, then asked, what did she want to know? Scroll didn't respond directly to her. Instead, she turned to the witch who wanted to return to the eastern region. Since she's still thinking about her hometown, it must mean she wasn't abandoned by her family. If that's the case, she was likely forced to leave because of the church's pressure and eventually went to the slumbering isle. The girl nodded in agreement. Scroll was spot on. Scroll continued, telling her that a few years ago, things were really bad in the eastern region. After Garcia and Timothy raided the region, the place was war-torn, the fields were abandoned, and people were barely surviving. Many became refugees. But 2 years ago, His Majesty Roland started a program to shelter these refugees, and now Neverwinter's population has surpassed 100,000. Most of these people are refugees from all over Greycastle. Maybe her family is among them. Scroll then asked where the girl used to live. The girl shook her head. Her village didn't really have a name. Some folks who had traveled called it 16 for some reason. Scroll, with her photographic memory, thought for a moment and then nodded. Before long, someone from the city hall had brought over a worker named What. After hearing the news, the man practically sprinted into the room, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked at the girl. Is it really you, Manhwa? He asked. His voice began to shake. He even started thanking the gods that she was still alive. The girl recognized him too. What, a familiar face from her past. Manhwa was the nickname her father and close relatives used to call her, but now she goes by Doris. What explained that everyone in the village had thought she was taken away by witches. Doris recounted her story, then anxiously asked about her family. What's expression darkened as he shook his head. In a low voice, he tells her that they didn't make it to Neverwinter. Doris covered her mouth, overcome with grief, and began to cry. What remembered how Doris's mother, on her deathbed, had kept repeating Doris's name. What began comforting her, saying she'd be relieved if she knew her daughter was still alive. Azima, unable to bear the scene, turned away, her own emotions welling up, while another witch started to cry, saying she missed her own family too. The room fell silent, the air heavy with sorrow. It wasn't until Doris finally calmed down that Scroll spoke again, telling them this is why it's important to document everyone. If any of their family members made it to Neverwinter, they would have been informed immediately. Maybe some of them are already here, waiting. Azima lowered her head, not saying a word. Scroll picked up the form again, asking them to fill it out, and this time, no one objected. As they left the apartment, Wendy couldn't help but marvel at Scroll's ability to remember the identities of all 100,000 people in Neverwinter. Doesn't that get confusing? She asked, genuinely curious. Scroll shrugged with a slight smile, saying she was honestly not sure how to explain it. At first, it was a bit overwhelming, but over time, everything just started to organize itself in her mind, like it was all automatically sorted. As long as she has a keyword, she can instantly recall the information she needs. Like earlier, when Doris mentioned 16. That's because the 16th village they passed on their way back from Golden Sickle City was where her home was. She then said that when Roland eventually unites Greycastle, she's not sure how much more she can keep track of. Wendy glanced at Scroll, a thought crossing her mind. Does this mean Scroll will end up remembering the lives of everyone on this land? Perhaps she is, their living history? They soon arrived back at the city hall when a man suddenly came running up to them, telling them there was someone in the main hall who refused to leave, and the person was demanding to see the head of the Witch Union. Before he could finish, the person in question appeared. He looked like an old farmer, and he was clearly anxious. Turned out, he found a girl outside the city, covered in blood. She looks like a witch, but she's barely conscious. Scroll frowned, thinking out loud. No witches were scheduled to leave the city today. Wendy quickly asked, how does the man know she's a witch? The farmer hesitated for a moment, then replied, well, ordinary people don't usually have, animal parts. The girl had a tail. Wendy's heart skipped a beat. The first person who came to mind was Lorca. Without wasting another second, she urged the man to take them over. As the scene shifts, Lorca lay motionless on the bench, her entire body battered and bruised. Her once cute, perky ears were now tattered and incomplete. Wendy and Scroll stared at her, trying to comprehend what could have happened to leave her in such a state. The old man who had found her looked worried, wondering, can this child still be saved? His voice filled with concern. But with Nanawa and Lily both out of the city, there was only one person who might be able to save her. Meanwhile, over at the city walls, Wade was patrolling as usual when the sudden blare of an alarm made his face go pale. This wasn't just any alarm, it was the highest level of alert. The officers behind him started to panic, but Wade spun around, shouting at them to pull themselves together and help him evacuate the townspeople. On the streets, confused residents milled about, unaware of what was happening. Wade clapped his hands, calling out, "Everyone, go home immediately. This is an enemy attack alarm." At the same time, the First Army soldiers were already up on the walls, fully armed and ready. Soldiers could be seen everywhere, checking their ammunition. Back in City Hall, Barov slammed his hand on the table, glaring at Wendy. Calling all this madness, he asked why would Wendy sound the highest alarm based on the incoherent ramblings of an injured witch. Did she not realize the chaos and losses this could cause? Wendy couldn't shake the image of Lorca, delirious and repeatedly muttering, "Demons, the demons are coming." It was the only course of action that made sense to her. Just then, Third Border Town connected in, and the witches of Takira had also received the news. Their stance was clear: anything involving demons should never be taken lightly. Barov then asked, "But where are these demons? They haven't even seen a shadow of them. Why all this caution?" Tilly and Ashes were present as well. Ashes stepped forward, saying it was more than necessary. She had fought Lorca before, and she knew her strength. For her to be injured this badly, she must have encountered at least 10 demons. Wendy then revealed that Lorca had a map on her, with part of the map being unmistakably marked by Maisie and lightning. The markings suggested that Lorca had ventured into the wilderness. If demons were really there, whatever their intentions, Neverwinter had to be prepared. The Takira witches agreed with the plan, and eventually, Barov backed down, though he couldn't hide his frustration. He believed that this might make it impossible to complete the tasks His Majesty assigned him, he grumbled. The supply shipments to the front lines, the logging operations, the gathering of mushroom and fruit, the livestock in the prairie pastures, all of it will be affected. Wendy reassured him she had already sent word to the northern region. Once the king receives the message, he'll issue new directives. And as for any losses, she takes full responsibility. A week quickly passed, though no sign of the demons had been found. Tilly sought out Barov, curious about how the townspeople were reacting. Wanting to know if everyone was frightened or if they were panicking, Barov stood up, giving Tilly a respectful bow before explaining, "The situation is under control." Perhaps guessed what she is concerned about, he reassured her, "No one is blaming the witches from Slumbering Isle for this." Tilly let out a sigh of relief. She was worried someone might start dredging up the old rumors about witches being the minions of demons. That would only destroy the fragile trust between the townspeople and the witches. Suddenly, Ling came rushing in, telling Wendy that the wolf sister was awake. Everyone immediately sprang into action, with Wendy being the first to head out the door. Barov started to follow, but Ashes blocked his path, telling him that it was the girls' dormitory, so it was better for him to stay here and wait. When Wendy arrived, she found Lorca struggling to sit up in bed. Despite still being severely injured, her body emitted a faint green glow. Her limbs, bones, and even internal organs had suffered significant damage. The only reason she was still alive was thanks to Nightfall's symbiosis seed, just enough for them to keep Lorca alive and wait for Manhwa to return for proper healing. Lorca weakly turned to Nightfall, who lay beside her, and whispered a thank you. Sipping on a chaos drink, she tried to make light of the situation, joking, saying it's not so bad since she gets to drink chaos drink every day now. Ashes stepped forward, looking quite serious, asking what exactly did she encounter? Lorca's face darkened as she began to recount the events. She described how she was in the forest after defeating the 2 demons when she first noticed something was wrong. Then, she witnessed an overwhelming number of demons swarming toward the ruins of Takira, so many that it was impossible to count them all. Among them were gigantic and ugly creatures, the likes of which she had never seen. These monsters looked both grotesque and terrifying. She recalled how the creature suddenly collapsed, its flesh seeping into the ground beneath it, causing the ground around it to change color. Soon, all of the bone creatures connected, and the surrounding trees began to wither. Eventually, even the bones of the monsters sank into the ground. Wendy recorded every word Lorca said, then asked, "What about her injuries?" Lorca admitted that she knew she couldn't handle an enemy like that on her own. So she decided to return to Neverwinter, hiding for days and hoping the demons wouldn't notice her during their horn from earlier. But she underestimated them. It wasn't until she began her retreat that she realized several demon squads had been lying in wait for her. Nightfall, listening nearby, was stunned, since she didn't expect demons to be so smart. Tilly, deep in thought, offered a possibility. That might mean there's a high-ranking demon commanding them. Ashes gently patted Lorca on the shoulder, offering some comfort, telling her that when facing an unknown enemy, there's no perfect plan. The fact that she managed to escape and bring this warning to them is already an incredible feat. Wendy watched by the door, surprised. It was the first time she had heard Ashes give such high praise. The group left the room and returned to the hall, where they recounted everything once more. The Takira witches were certain that they couldn't allow the demons to take control of the Takira ruins. They believed that if the demons managed to build a black stone spire, the red mist could cover the entire mountain range, one of the Takira witches warned. At that point, any resistance would be meaningless. Fortunately, they've discovered the demons early, and with at least 3 years before the red moon descends, thus they have time to prepare and strike first. Varev suddenly stood up. Wait a minute, is that Roland? How is he here? Isn't he all the way up north? Anyway, let's continue the story. Varev argued that the city gates couldn't stay on high alert forever. Since the demon army was still far away, he suggested lifting the lockdown and getting the livestock operations back up and running. Another official chimed in, agreeing with Varev, remembering that His Majesty once said that building deeper defensive lines increases the defender's margin for error. If Lady Lian could set up a few signal towers along the prairie border, or perhaps use those communication seals, it would be even better. One of the Takira witches stepped forward, holding up a magic stone. They will be taking on the task. Since they know where the demons are stationed, they can use this to monitor them without any blind spots. Wendy recognized the magic stone. Clearly the Takira witches were thinking of using the illusion device for precise tracking. However, this would require someone to get dangerously close to the Takira ruins to make it work. But the place was already crawling with demons. Aletheia shrugged off the concern, calling it a minor task, saying every one of them is prepared to sacrifice themselves if necessary. But Tilly quickly intervened, shaking her head. The best plan is the one that doesn't require sacrifices and decides to take on the task. The witches from Slumbering Isle have just arrived here and they should take on some responsibilities. As the scene shifts, we return north. The earlier image of Roland in the meeting must have been a mistake. Anyway, let's ignore that and continue. Roland seemed to be lost in thought. He was so distracted that he didn't even hear Nightingale calling his name. It wasn't until he felt a tickling sensation near his ear that he snapped back to reality. Nightingale looked worried, since he had been zoning out for days. Ever since he saw those images, she asked if everything was all right. Roland spills the truth. It's just really strange. He isn't sure why would Lon from the dream world appear in those images. He can't make sense of it. Nightingale, now sitting in a lounge chair, says she isn't clever enough and thus can't help him with this. She recommended him to talk with Anna, but Roland shook his head, saying he hadn't mentioned it to Anna. Nightingale immediately jumped up from the chair, her expression surprised. Why not? Roland believed these are problems only he can solve. Telling her would just add to her worries. Nightingale blinked a few times, then suddenly seemed to think of something. A small smile crept across her face, and for some reason, she looked unexpectedly pleased. She pulled out a piece of dried fish and popped it into her mouth, looking quite satisfied. But Roland asked her not to tell anyone about this. Roland's thoughts drifted back to the image of Lon. How could a fictional character from the dream world appear during the early days of the Federation? Even Agatha and Phyllis didn't recognize the person in the image. That period in Takira's history was so distant that all they could guess was that she might have been an important figure. It looked like he would need to return to the dream world once more. When Roland opened his eyes again, he was back there. He picked up his phone and dialed Garcia's number. She answered quickly. Her breathing seemed to be a bit rapid, and it seemed she was out for a run. "What's up?" Garcia asked. Roland wanted to ask her something, and soon, they agreed to meet at the apartment building's entrance. Roland quickly got dressed and rushed out of his room. As he passed through the living room, he saw Zero, half asleep and rubbing her eyes. "Wait a sec," she mumbled, still groggy, saying she would go boil some hot water. Seeing her pajama strap slipping off her shoulder, Roland gently pulled it back up for her, while told her to not worry, and to get ready for school, and he would bring breakfast back. Zero, holding her toothbrush, watched in confusion as he dashed out the door, wondering what had gotten into him. Roland met Garcia at a small restaurant downstairs. He ordered 2 bowls of beef noodles, to which Garcia gave a slightly exasperated sigh, saying if she were a guy, she'd never bring a woman to a place like this for breakfast. No wonder why Roland is still single. Roland chuckled and explained, Zero has school soon, and he needs to bring breakfast back for her. Thus they can't go too far. Soon, the owner brought over their bowls of noodles. Garcia thanked the owner politely, then snapped apart her wooden chopsticks. She stirred the noodles in her bowl, lifted them, blew on them to cool them down, and started slurping the noodles. Roland smiled, watching her. Looks like she comes here often. He was worried that she didn't like these small joints. Garcia smirked, saying this was all his misconception. She'd lived here for 10 years and had tried every place around. It's good manners to take people to cleaner, nicer places. Also, she doesn't like being stared at all the time. Roland glanced around and realized she was right. Not only were other customers at the stand sneaking glances at them, but even passers-by had their eyes on her, casting looks their way. He wanted to apologize, but Garcia nudged him and asked what's the deal. Roland got to the point and tells her that he wanted to meet her mentor. Garcia raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Roland explained how he felt really bad about missing their last meeting and he likes to apologize in person. Though surprised, Garcia shook her head. Believed that her mentor won't see him again. Roland tried to sound hopeful. Maybe Lady Lan doesn't dislike him that much. But Garcia disagreed. Since her mentor can't stand people who don't keep their promises, Roland still pressed her to at least make the call. Garcia gave him a knowing look, doubting that he just wanted to apologize. Roland hesitated, then said if he could also get some training tips, that'd be great. Garcia pulled out her phone. As she dialed, Roland asked if he could have her mentor's number, but she informed him that only a special association card could make that call. As the call connected, she told him to be quiet. A few minutes later, the call ended, and Garcia turned to Roland with a frown. So, how did it go? Roland asked, half expecting bad news. She refused, of course. Garcia snapped, and also seemed a bit annoyed. Turned out, she was chewed out for even asking. From the tone, it's clear that her mentor is really disappointed in Roland. Roland couldn't believe it. In his mind, he thought to himself that doesn't make sense. She didn't seem that upset last time. But it was clear that he wouldn't get the meeting he hoped for. He then asked, when's the next time he can visit the headquarters? Garcia tells him when he can handle an erosion event on his own and become an official martial fighter. That condition is surprisingly simple, Roland thought to himself as he lifted his bowl and drank the soup down to the last drop. He then brought up Lan's cryptic statement from the other day, saying he was curious and wanted to know what she meant when she said the divine war is not far off. Garcia leaned back in her chair, explaining that her mentor believes in a book written over half a century ago, titled The Reason for Existence. It's a philosophical work that speculates on the emergence and evolution of civilizations, framing them as part of something called the God's choice. He also tells him to not get the wrong idea, the gods here aren't some personified beings. It's more like a set of rules, or perhaps the purpose behind the continuation of all things. Roland's mind raced. In his mind, this was another book he never heard of. This likely meant it was something unique to the dream world, a creation of that strange reality. He then asked if he could borrow the book. Garcia gave him a curious look but didn't refuse, saying she will check it out from the headquarters library. That is, if she remembers. Back in the real world, Roland felt no closer to the answers he sought. If anything, his thoughts were more tangled than before. Suddenly, Lightning burst into his tent, holding a bird in her hands. A message from Neverwinter, she announced. Roland took the letter and flattened it out on the table. As he read it, he couldn't help but freeze in shock. The demon's army had appeared in the wilderness.